New states, founded by outsiders, rose to fill the void left by the collapse of Hammurabi's empire. In northern Mesopotamia, a kingdom emerged which was called by its people the land of the Hurrians, but which was known to its neighbors as Hanagalbat or Mitanni. Much remains mysterious about the Hurrians and Mitanni. We don't even know the location of Mitanni's capital, Washukani, nor do we know the names of most of Mitanni's rulers or the dates of their reigns. Part of the problem is the limited extent of our sources. Since we don't know where Mitanni's capital was located, obviously we haven't been able to uncover Mitanni's governmental archives. Furthermore, the Hurrians don't seem to have acquired what scholars call the epigraphic habit, so we don't have any inscriptions that memorialize their rulers and their activities. Neighboring countries' references to them never discuss the Hurrians in their own right, but only as they impinged on the neighbors' own lives and affairs. So the most thorough sources we have for the kingdom of Mitanni come from the archives of two of its vassal states, Nuzi and Olalla. But both are written in Akkadian, not Hurrian, and they reflect Babylonian, not Hurrian social customs, so we can't say how representative they are of life among the Hurrians and inside Mitanni. Beside the materials from Nuzi and Olalla, we also have a scattering of Hurrian literary texts that somehow wound up in Ugarit in western Syria and in the Hittite archives at Hadashas, as well as information from Egypt in the cache of 14th century diplomatic texts known as the Amarna letters. All in all, our fullest material comes from the centuries between about 1500 and about 1200 BC. But there isn't much of it, and it says very little about political history and imperial administration in Mitanni. Even the Hurrian language is an enigma. We don't know for sure what its linguistic affiliations were, so we have a hard time figuring out where the Hurrians originated before they showed up in the Near East. We know that Hurrian wasn't a Semitic language. We also know that it wasn't an Indo-European language. Truth be told, we don't even know what it was called by the people who spoke it. It's the Hittites who called it Hurrian. We do know that when they first appeared on the stage of Near Eastern history, the Hurrians lived in the Caucasus Mountains. From there, they slowly infiltrated into northern Mesopotamia and Syria, beginning in the Akkadian and Ur-III periods during the late 3rd millennium BC. By the early 2nd millennium, they'd established a significant presence in the communities in the northern Fertile Crescent. They formed a substantial minority of the population in Syria and southeast Anatolia. We find Hurrian enclaves in Mari, Ebla, and other cities of the area, and individuals with Hurrian names show up in many other smaller towns. From this time on, Hurrian gods also frequently appear in religious texts, and a Hurrian language literature slowly begins to develop. It was sometime in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC that the Hurrians founded the kingdom of Mitanni. At the zenith of its power, Mitanni ruled over an area from northern Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean coast of Syria. Two factors seem to have led to its rise. One was the power vacuum in northern Mesopotamia. Shamshi-Adad's kingdom of Upper Mesopotamia was the last state that had controlled the entire region. Its collapse had been followed by political fragmentation because Hammurabi had been more interested in the west, east, and south than in expanding his empire very far to the north. So when his empire broke up in the late 1700s, there was no major power remaining in either central or northern Mesopotamia. The power vacuum spread to Syria when, around 1600 BC, the Hittite king Mershilas I destroyed the principalities that had dominated the area without then placing Syria under Hittite rule. Shortly afterwards, in 1595, Mershilas also destroyed the kingdom of the First Dynasty of Babylon, sacking Babylon itself and then withdrawing to Anatolia, leaving nothing but ruins in his wake. So it was into this power vacuum that Mitanni emerged. The second factor leading to the rise of Mitanni appears to have been the arrival of an Indo-Iranian group among the Hurrians. Scholars have debated back and forth what effect this Indo-Iranian group had. Some have even questioned whether it existed. The balance of opinion seems to be that it did exist, but that it was small, because very few Indo-Iranian names appear among the Hurrians. It's typical in situations like this for scholars to suggest that the intrusive element was probably a warrior caste. This Indo-Iranian group seems to have arrived in the late 1600s and infused the Hurrian principalities along the upper Euphrates with a political energy that they seem to have lacked before. The first signs of this new political energy appear when Hittite records report Hurrian attacks on the eastern frontiers of the Hittite kingdom in the years just before 1600. The scattered Hurrian principalities of Upper Mesopotamia then finally coalesced into the kingdom of Mitanni sometime between about 1550 and about 1500 BC. As an empire, Mitanni differed sharply from most of its predecessors in the ancient Near East. It was a decentralized state with a lot of similarities to feudalism. Instead of a centrally administered system of provinces, the kingdom of Mitanni appears to have comprised a network of client states bound to the Hurrian king by oaths of loyalty. Territories seem mostly to have been absorbed into Mitanni by treaty rather than by conquest. Mitanni subject states were treated by the king as vassals. They were left under their own rulers and enjoyed both internal autonomy and limited freedom to deal with local border issues. It's been suggested that Mitanni was basically a loose confederation of autonomous communities, each of which sent tribute and troops to the Hurrian king. This is intriguing, but it should also remind us that whatever information we recover from these client states is likely to tell us very little about the institutional features of the central Mitannian government, assuming it had any institutional features to begin with. In line with this decentralization, the Mitannian king appears to have functioned primarily as a kind of high king or war leader. His official title was King of the Hurrian Warriors, which suggests that he functioned mainly as the commander of whatever contingents were furnished by the members of the Federation, which is very much a feudal sort of model. Some scholars speculate that the Mitannian kings came from the Indo-Iranian warrior elite. But against this hypothesis is the fact that while the kings took throne names in Indo-Iranian, the ones whose personal names we know had names that typically were Hurrian instead. We know very little about the kings or their activities. We have the names of about a dozen of them, but almost nothing more. We don't have enough chronological evidence to establish the dates of their reigns or even figure out how long they reigned. The first Mitannian king we know of is Shutarna I, son of Kirta, but his name is all that we know about him. We found it on a seal impression that dates to sometime in the 16th century BC. Shutarna's successor was named Paratarna. We know Paratarna solely from an inscription set up at Alala by a local dynast whom Paratarna installed in power around 1500. The most powerful and successful Mitannian king seems to have been Saosatar, who reigned during the 15th century. Saosatar conquered Assyria and established a Mitannian resident officer in Ashur, putting it under Mitannian supervision, though not under direct Mitannian rule. He went on to expand Mitannian control even farther east, beyond the Tigris. He also extended Mitannian overlordship into eastern Anatolia. After Saosatar's reign, subsequent Mitannian rulers went on to establish networks of client states in northern Syria as well. At the peak of its power in the late 15th century, Mitanni's authority extended from Tarsus in southeastern Anatolia down to Kadesh in Syria and east to the Zagros foothills beyond Ashur. The Mitannian army was built around its chariot corps. Called the Marianu, the chariot corps was commanded in person by the king, forming something like a Mitannian royal guard. It was once thought that the Marianu were a hereditary warrior caste, drawn from that Indo-Iranian element in Mitanni. But that idea has now been discarded. For one thing, Marianu is a Hurrian word, not, as we used to think, an Indo-Iranian one. Furthermore, we now realize that they weren't an exclusive group. and that men could be recruited or appointed to membership in the Marianu, even by Mitannian vassals. We've also found groups comparable to the Marianu in other Near Eastern states during the same time period. So what little information we have indicates that the Marianu were responsible for tending their own horses and chariots, but received their horses from the crown and were paid by the king in rations and in land. Because of its location in northern Mesopotamian Syria, Mitanni faced rivals on several fronts. Its most dangerous rival lay to the west, in Anatolia, the Hittite Empire of Hatti. Relations between Hatti and Mitanni were rarely cordial. The problem went back to the early days of both empires. The Hurrians had attacked eastern Anatolia as early as the late 17th century, when Hatti was first emerging under Hattushailus I. This Hurrian attack sparked a major revolt against Hattushailus, which he only suppressed after strenuous campaigning. This gave the Hittites a bitter grudge against the Hurrians, which of course they carried over to Mitanni when it finally emerged. To add to the antipathy between the two kingdoms, in the late 15th century, Mitanni seized control of the Hittite vassal kingdom of Kizzuadna in Cilicia in southeastern Anatolia on Syria's northern border. And Mitanni had also actively stirred up trouble in the Hittite vassal kingdom of Isua on the frontier between the two countries. And finally, the two empires clashed repeatedly over the allegiance of the city-states, the border zone of northern Syria. Meanwhile, south of Syria, in the Levant, throughout the 15th century BC, conflict flared between Mitanni and the rapidly expanding empire of New Kingdom Egypt. These clashes often pitted Mitannian vassals against the Egyptians, rather than directly involving the Mitannian army itself. This was the case at the Battle of Megiddo, which was fought between the pharaoh Thutmose III and Mitanni's client ruler from Kadesh. Eventually, the frontier stabilized between the two empires in the Orontes Valley of central Syria, north of Ugarit. Finally, at the end of the 15th century, when both Egypt and Mitanni became increasingly alarmed by the rise of Hittite power, Thutmose IV concluded a treaty with the Mitannian king Artadama I and took a Mitannian princess into the Egyptian harem. Relations remained peaceful after that. Later Mitannian kings like Shutarna II and Tushratta contributed daughters to the Egyptian harem as well. Mitanni collapsed in the 14th century BC. The causes of its collapse are as murky as the rest of Mitanni's history. The underlying cause may have lain in the nature of Mitanni's imperial system, such as it was. Its decentralized, semi-feudal structure left it vulnerable to attack from its powerful and ambitious neighbors. And this decentralization meant that Mitanni had a weak military. In a feudal system like Mitanni's, it was difficult to muster armies quickly, and that made it hard to respond swiftly to threats. It appears that the only standing royal military force was the Mariano Chariot Corps. And furthermore, Mitanni was prone to centrifugal political forces. Because of their relative autonomy, vassals might cherish dreams of complete independence, and they possessed the means to make those dreams come true. This was particularly the case with Mitanni's eastern subject, Assyria, which asserted its independence in the middle of the 14th century BC. But the immediate cause of Mitanni's collapse seemed to have been political upheaval within the Mitannian royal house, which gave an opening to her enemies. In the late 14th century, there was a civil war for the Mitannian throne between two rival princes. Shutarna II's son and heir, Artashumara, was murdered by a shadowy figure called Udhi, who was probably not of royal blood. Udhi and his party established Shutarna's younger son, Tushratta, on the throne. Tushratta eventually was able to execute Udhi and his backers, but the instability had alerted ambitious nobles to the weakness of the royal house. Some noble factions rejected Tushratta as king, and instead backed a powerful baron from northeastern Mitanni, who took the throne as Artadama II. In the midst of the civil war, Mitanni's neighbors pounced and dismembered the kingdom. The Hittite king Suppiluliumus first conquered and then annexed Mitanni's territories in northern Syria, after which he invaded Mitanni itself and sacked Washukani. This may have been the actual blow that triggered the Mitannian civil war. The Assyrians under Ashur-uballit then asserted their independence and gobbled up eastern Mitanni, including Artidama's territories. As Mitanni fell apart, Tushratta was murdered by one of his sons, and Shatarna III, Artidama's son, took the throne. Tushratta's surviving son, Shadiwaza, tried to flee with a detachment of charioteers to Babylonia, but the Babylonians treated him as an enemy. Shadiwaza then fled to the Hittites, who received him as royalty, gave him a princess as his bride, and sent him back to Mitanni with an army. Shadiwaza was installed as client king of the western rump of Mitanni, under the supervision of the Hittite viceroy at Carchemish. By 1320, Mitanni, as an independent kingdom, had ceased to exist. As Mitanni was rising to power in the northern Fertile Crescent, to the south, a people named the Kassites moved into the vacuum left behind by the Hittite sack of Babylon in 1595 and united Babylonia under their authority. The Kassites appear in Babylonian records from the early years of the second millennium BC, both as mercenaries and as small groups living on the fringes of northern Mesopotamia and raiding cities in the region. Like the Hurrians, the Kassites' ethnic associations are a puzzle. They show no obvious relationship to any other peoples, and although little of their language has been preserved, we know enough of it to say that they were neither Semitic nor Indo-European. Their names are also distinctive in form, completely different from Babylonian names, and those Kassite names that incorporate divine elements show that they worshipped a different religious pantheon as well. They appear to have come to Mesopotamia from the mountains of western Iran, and settled at first along the upper reaches of the Diyala River and its tributaries. After they slipped down the Diyala into Mesopotamia, the Kassites quickly assimilated into Babylonian culture and won the acceptance of the indigenous population. But even though they adopted Babylonian culture, the Kassites retained their own tribal structure, and in later texts they're still identified as Kassites rather than as Babylonians. But Kassite kings recognized how big a role religion played in Mesopotamian life, so they became very active patrons of Babylonian religious cults, which probably helps to account for why their subjects accepted them as legitimate rulers. The Kassites' great accomplishment was to complete the welding of Mesopotamia into a cohesive and self-conscious unit that thought of itself as Babylonia rather than the collection of quarreling city-states and petty principalities that it had been for so long. This is reflected in the fact that they were the first rulers to take the title King of Babylonia. Maybe this was only possible because they came from outside. That enabled them to see what the Mesopotamians had in common and to build on it, where the Mesopotamians themselves could only see the things that divided them, as their habit of repeatedly lapsing back into bickering anarchy shows. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Kassite rule is its sheer duration. Their Babylonian empire lasted 440 years, until 1155 BC, longer than any other empire in the ancient Near East, and longer than any other empire outside the Near East too, until the time of Rome. What enabled the Kassites to capitalize on the Babylonian power vacuum and establish their kingdom is a mystery. For a long time, historians thought it was their introduction of the light two-wheeled chariot and the cavalry horse. That idea has been rejected. We now know that chariots first appeared in Mesopotamia and the Near East early in the second millennium BC, when the Kassites were little more than a nuisance, and they were quickly adopted throughout the region. And nothing in the second millennium sources suggests any unique Kassite association with horses or any particular Kassite role in horse breeding. It was in the decades following the Hittite raid on Babylon that the Kassites emerged from obscurity and took control of central and lower Mesopotamia. The first Kassite king about whom anything is known to us, other than his name, is Agum II in the 16th century. He ruled central Mesopotamia and the mountains east of the Tigris, as well as southern Mesopotamia, except for the Sealand, which was the home of the Chaldeans. Agum II's successor twice removed, Ulamburiash, succeeded in adding the Sealand to the Kassites' empire, making Mesopotamia a unified whole. He then took the title King of Babylonia, King of Sumer and Akkad, King of the Kassites, King of Karduniash. After the conquest of the sea land, the Kassites launched naval expeditions down the Persian Gulf and conquered strategic locations like Bahrain, which they ruled directly through Kassite governors rather than through local client kings. But their attention was focused to the south, not to the north. The Kassite kingdom never included northern Mesopotamia and Assyria. Kassite kings were especially interested in controlling the trade route that carried lapis lazuli from Afghanistan to Babylonia, a route that ran from Babylon east through the Diyala Valley to the Iranian plateau and on to the Hindu Kush. It was to secure this route that the Kassite king Kurigalzu I built a fortress capital called Dur-Kurigalzu, modern city of Kuf, in the early 14th century. The Kassites were part of what has been called the Club of the Great Powers, a network of empires that dominated the Near East during the middle and late second millennium. Members of the club were closely linked to one another by diplomatic exchanges. The club's roster included New Kingdom Egypt, Hatti, the Kassites, and eventually Assyria. Equality of the member monarchs was indicated by the fact that they addressed one another as brothers. Their relations have a very sort of 19th century Victorian feel about them. Upon coming to the throne, a new king of a great power would formally notify his brothers of his accession and dispatch gifts as his earnest of maintaining good relations. The monarchs regularly exchanged messages, inquiring after each other's health and expressing concern when one or another of them fell ill. They were expected to invite each other to important festivals, and even though the invited monarchs never came, polite protests would be sent if expected invitations weren't forthcoming. The Amarna letters from New Kingdom Egypt cast particular light on the mechanisms of this great power diplomacy. Embassies sent to foreign rulers usually consisted of several envoys, who were close to the dispatching ruler and were usually identified by their name and their position at court. Evidently, one of them would get an audience with the receiving monarch. The receiving monarch would give the envoys gifts, whose value reflected the esteem in which he held their sovereign. Typically, these would be gold, silver, oil, and necessities, all for the envoy's personal use. If the gifts were of lesser quality, or if the envoys were left cooling their heels waiting to be received, this was taken as a slight to the status of their king. Envoys were used to convey goodwill messages and requests between rulers. They also provided information about their king and country and tried to gather as much information as they could in return. The gifts they brought were expected to be displayed, and the sender of the gifts was expected to be acknowledged. The gifts were meticulously inventoried on dispatch, and the weights of precious items were noted, certified by the sender to guarantee their value. On receipt, the inventory was checked by the recipient, and the stated weights were rigorously tested. Diplomatic envoys often traveled as passengers with merchant caravans. Those caravans were attacked and plundered. The monarch in whose territory the incident occurred was held personally responsible, and compensation was demanded. When the envoys arrived, a formal reception was held at which they were expected to make contact with any of their rulers' daughters or sisters who had been married off to the receiving king. This let the envoys make sure that she was being treated in accord with her status, and the treatment was duly noted and reported back home. Indignant protests might be filed if royal brides felt that they were being slighted. Kassite rule brought important changes to Mesopotamian economic and social organization. Private land ownership replaced the communal holdings of the past. These private lands are documented in the numerous surviving royal deeds called kuduru. Thanks to the introduction of private land ownership, Mesopotamian society became highly stratified. A distinction grew up between influential tax-exempt groups and the ordinary people who consequently paid the lion's share of taxes. The privileged groups included the residents of towns and cities and the large landowners. Burdened with taxes and labor services, the ordinary people, who were primarily small landowners and tenant farmers, became increasingly indebted to the crown. Debt was further heightened because the Kassites had deregulated money lending. The result was debt slavery, which under the Kassites became a permanent, not a temporary state of bondage. Lacking any other recourse, people often fled their economic burdens and debt slavery and became exiles, fugitives, known as hapiru. This swelling depopulation of economic fugitives destabilized the borders of Babylonia. The hapiru took to the foothills, became nomads in the desert steppes, supplementing their meager livelihoods with robbery. We have little information about Kassite imperial administration. Our main source is the archives found in the city of Nippur, which only illuminate Kassite administration in the Nippur area itself during the period between 1360 and 1225. From those archives, we can say that the administration of the province of Nippur was highly centralized, controlled by a Kassite governor. The governor presided over an organization that collected revenues in agricultural and animal products, often in large quantities. These he redistributed to government officials, soldiers, and temple staff in the form of rations, whose quantities were determined by the recipient's rank within the hierarchy. The governor's office was secular, but some governors also served as high priests of Enlil, whose temple was one of the most important institutions in Babylonia, and control over the revenues of which made the governor second in rank and wealth only to the Kassite king. The temple organization provided people with loans and advances, maybe in return for labor, and this in turn may have contributed to the indebtedness that was so rife in Babylonia at the time. What we don't know is how representative the province of Nippur was of administration elsewhere in the Kassite Empire. The Kassite Empire finally collapsed in the late 13th and 12th centuries. The most fundamental cause was geopolitical. Babylonia was exposed to powerful enemies on three sides. To the north, Assyria had grown into an imperial power in her own right, and the two kingdoms clashed over their ill-defined mutual border and over control of the trade routes that crossed northern Mesopotamia between Iran and the Mediterranean. In southwest Iran, a resurgent kingdom of Elam began launching raids into Kassite territory from the 14th century on. The Kassites counterattacked into Elam and briefly conquered the Elamite capital of Susa, but they were unable to hold it. The only enduring result was the emergence of a more powerful and even more hostile Elamite state. To the west, the Aramaean nomads who populated the desert fringe began raiding the rich croplands of the river valleys. Desperate attempts to stave off disaster through diplomacy proved futile. The Kassites concluded an alliance with the Hittites and Egypt against the Aramaeans and Assyrians. The alliance collapsed as all three faced increasing threats that ultimately proved fatal. In the late 13th century, the inevitable happened and Kassite Babylonia was attacked simultaneously on multiple fronts. Around 1230, the Elamites launched a devastating raid into Babylonia. The Assyrians attacked from the north. Tukulti-Ninurta I, king of Assyria, sacked Babylon in 1225, took the Kassite king Kashtilyashu IV back to Ashur in chains, and installed an Assyrian puppet on the Kassite throne. The puppet lasted only 7 years before he was driven out, and another Kassite was installed in his place. In 1192, the Kassite king Adad-Shum-Utsur was able to return the favor by intervening in an Assyrian dynastic war and briefly installing his own puppet in Ashur. But in the end, Kassite Babylonia succumbed. It was Elam that delivered the coup de grace. In 1155, the Elamite king Shutruk-Nahunte crossed the Tigris and led his army through Lower Babylonia, taking and sacking many cities. He overthrew the last Kassite king, Enlil-nadin-Ahi, and placed Babylonia under an Elamite governor. The Elamites savagely looted the cities of Mesopotamia and then imposed tribute on them. Attempts at rebellion were mercilessly crushed. The Kassites were succeeded briefly by the Isin dynasty, whose most forceful and famous ruler was Nebuchadrezzar I. Around 1110, he avenged the Kassites by conquering Susa and destroying Elam. But his success was temporary. Soon afterwards, Babylonia fell into political obscurity, and there it was to languish for 500 years. While the Hurrians and Kassites were establishing their kingdoms, the dream of empire had spread west, beyond the confines of Mesopotamia, and there it had taken root, among a people known as the Hittites.